This will be the most horrible thing you hear today. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Joanna. Good afternoon. My name is Zoe Clark-Hoplis. I'm the Deputy Attorney General up in Newcastle County. I have the coveted role of opening your 2018 Foia training. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Otherwise known as the Freedom of Information Act training. I'm here to give you disclaimers. That's my major job. So this is a training that is mandated by the statute, and it was specifically provided by the legislature that this presentation is not to be construed as legal advice. So I'm going to say that several times over the course of just a few slides, because we do want to burn that into your brains. The information that we're giving you today is a summary of portions of the law. We can't cover every situation that might arise. We can't address fact-specific questions. So if you do have one of those fact-specific questions, we need you to contact your legal counsel. If you have general questions about some of the topics that commonly arise in FOIA petitions, there is also an easy reference manual at the Department of Justice website titled the Policy Manual. This is the legislative declaration behind FOIA. It states the purpose for the law. To summarize that language, these are the purposes of FOIA. It's meant to promote transparency in government. It's meant to make our citizenry informed. And it's supposed to make it possible for the citizens of the state of Delaware to observe and monitor the performance of public officials. Yes, there will be a lot of reading from slides today. The FOIA manual that I mentioned earlier was created by the Department of Justice. It's specifically meant to assist FOIA coordinators, although it is available to members of the public, as it's on a public website. It's published biannually, so it was last put up on November 1st, 2017 on the Open Government webpage. And like I said earlier, it's an easy reference to FOIA. It's not a huge deep dive into the topics that are throughout the statute, but it does have some of the situations and contexts that have commonly arisen in the context of FOIA petitions. This is the FOIA training, which I hope you know that you're here for today. I hope that's why you're in this room. By statute, we present it annually. It's meant to provide guidance to FOIA coordinators and anyone who works for a public body involved in responding to FOIA requests. It's also open to the public itself. In this training, we're going to discuss the statute, some of the case law, and the Attorney General opinions that interpret the statute. Here's a more detailed covered slide on what the presentation is actually going to cover. It is a bit different this year. We did switch it up, so in the end we're going to have a panel discussion with the FOIA coordinators from several state agencies on the best practices. Throughout the presentation, you're going to hear judicial and Attorney General opinions that pertain to FOIA over the last 2 years that pertain to these specific topics. The coordinator's duties and responsibilities in responding to petitions, requests for information, FOIA petitions to the Attorney General, so the process by which a citizen who feels that they have not gotten the information they should can come to our office for redress, the deadlines associated with those requests, and fees that can be charged by a public body responding to a FOIA request. There's also a section on open meetings and the exemption to open meetings, which is the executive session. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Attorney General Joanna Suter to talk about FOIA coordinators.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. A little bit? Okay. So I can think of nothing more lawyerly than for me to stand up here and to tell you how to do your jobs that you do every day and have been doing for years. So we'll get started. FOIA coordinators, all of you are most likely FOIA coordinators. All public bodies must designate a FOIA coordinator and provide to DOJ the name of that FOIA coordinator and their contact information. This information must also be posted on the public body's website, and if there is a change in who the FOIA coordinator is, that needs to be communicated to DOJ within 20 working days of the change. The Foia Coordinator is responsible for coordinating and processing FOIA requests, kind of in the name. The Foia Coordinator is required to coordinate the public body's responses to FOIA requests, assist the requesting party in identifying records sought, assist the public body in locating and providing records, and work to foster cooperation with the requesting party, and also maintain a document that tracks all FOIA requests. That FOIA tracking sheet must include the requesting party's contact information, the date the public body received the request, the public body's response deadline, the date of the public body's response, including reasons for any extension, which we'll go into in a little bit, the names, contact information, and dates of correspondence of those contacted in connection with the FOIA request, so anyone you reached out to at your public body in hopes of fulfilling the request, the dates of review of documents responsive to the request, names of individuals who conducted the review, whether documents were produced, an amount of administrative and copying fees assessed, and date of final disposition of FOIA request. The statute is pretty comprehensive. I'm sure most of you work with it a lot. It includes the form of FOIA requests. They can be sent in person, by mail, fax, or online. Also lays out the roles and duties of FOIA coordinators, which we just went through, and how a public body should respond to a FOIA request generally, a FOIA request for emails, and a FOIA request for non-custodial records. How a public body should review records to identify exemptions from the definition of public body. Most of you know that's a lot of your job. Access that must be provided for review of public records, and fees applicable to searching, copying, and producing records. Sometimes petitions will be made to the Attorney General's office following a FOIA request. A FOIA coordinator should be aware of what happens when a response to a FOIA request, or lack thereof, is challenged through a petition to the AG's office. Know the enforcement statute. Be ready to draft or have your counsel draft a response to the Attorney General by the date requested. As many of you know who have dealt with this before, it's a pretty quick turnaround on those dates. And be prepared to respond to and cooperate with requests for additional information. Quickly, we're going to go through responding to requests for records. Statute requires that all public bodies adopt a policy to address FOIA requests. The policy may not violate the statute, and a FOIA request conforming to the policy may not be denied solely because the body's form is not used. So if you have a FOIA request form on your website, you can't deny a request simply because someone doesn't use that online form. A FOIA policy may include provisions that allow for the waiver of some or all of the administrative fees, which must apply equally to a particular class of persons, i.e. the press or nonprofit agencies. Important deadlines. Initial responses to a FOIA request required as soon as possible, but no later than 15 business days from the date of receipt of the request. Responses must indicate one of the following: the records are being provided, and actually provide the records too. Don't just tell them you're going to provide them and get to it like 90 days later. Actually provide them. The FOIA request is denied in whole or in part, including the basis for the denial, and we'll get to denials in a minute. And additional time is needed, and we'll get to that now. So if the response indicates that additional time is needed, it must indicate one of the following reasons for additional time. There are no other statutory bases for additional time. 1, the records sought are voluminous. 2, the record requires legal advice in connection with the request. Or 3, records are in storage or archived and will take some time to get. In addition to providing the reason for the request for extension, the public body must also include a good faith estimate of how much additional time is needed. Soon, as soon as we can, not gonna fly. We usually need an actual amount of time. And if you give an amount of time at a good faith basis, and then find that you're up against that deadline, you can reach back out to the requester and say, we thought it was gonna be 2 weeks to get the records from archives. It's gonna be a little bit longer, we apologize, here's our modified time frame. Requests for emails. FOIA requires each public body to attempt to fill requests using its own staff from its own records. Only after exhausting an internal search should an agency seek assistance from a third-party technology service provider. DTI, if you're a state public body, charges an hourly rate to retrieve emails and only maintains some emails for 1 year. Here are some suggested steps to provide responsive emails. Identify the employees most likely to have access to the emails identified in the request. Request that those employees search for responsive documents. And if an employee cannot be identified or cannot conduct the search, work with internal IT personnel to fulfill the request. If the public body cannot fulfill the request from internal records, contact a third-party service provider to assist with the search. Denials must include the reason a request or part thereof is denied, and you have no obligation to provide an index or other listing of the records that were withheld. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lauren McGuire for fees.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to generally go over some standard fees and rules and policies related to those fees. As everyone knows, in responding to a FOIA request, a public body is permitted to charge fees. However, there are limitations on that. Fees should be minimized to the greatest extent possible. In addition, the statute sets forth applicable fees, but those fees can be an alternative fee schedule can be set in county or municipal codes. Okay, for just standard photocopy fees, the statutory fees are as follows. The first 20 pages of the standard size copies are free. After those initial 20 pages, copies can be provided at 10 cents per sheet, 20 cents for a double-sided sheet. Oversized copies are considered those greater than 11 by 17, and the fees are listed here at $2 per sheet for 18 by 22, $3 per sheet for 24 by 36, or $1 per square foot for anything larger than 24 by 36. If you're providing color copies, an additional charge of $1 per sheet for standard copies, or $1.50 per sheet for larger copies. For administrative fees that are associated with identifying and providing records, the statute suggests that administrative fees are required, but agencies can adopt policies that would waive those fees. The statute does set forth that fees are permitted only for requests requiring more than 1 hour of staff time to process. And again, although the fees are permitted by the statute, a public body must attempt to minimize those fees and charge only those that are reasonably required to process the request. The language in the statute says make every effort to minimize those fees. What may be considered and added in terms of the administrative fees are staff time associated with processing the request, including identifying records, monitoring file reviews, generating computer records. Those fees must be billed per quarter hour at the hourly pay grade of the lowest paid employee capable of performing the service. In terms of what may not be charged as part of an administrative fee, fees may not be charged for the legal review of the response. And the Department of Justice has interpreted this provision as saying that legal review is not limited to review by lawyers. With very few exceptions, any review that considers whether FOIA exemptions apply is considered a legal review. And any fee waivers must comply with FOIA policy and be applied consistently. Other charges that, in addition to just the standard copy charges, first 20 pages of any microfilm or microfiche will be free, and after that will be 15 cents per page. For electronic records, charges are calculated by the material costs involved in generating the copies, as well as administrative fees. There also could be third-party custodian fees. providing an estimate for fees.
Just a quick clarification. If you do a request and the first 20 pages are free and then there's a successive request after that, or request by the same individual on a related topic, do you start again each time they make a new request? Do you restart at 20 and you restart the process?
I think that's something that, and tell me if I'm wrong, that may be covered in our question and answer at the end. So I think that, I believe that may be the case. If not, I'll follow up with you there. In regards to estimates, an itemized written cost estimate should be provided for any administrative fees that would be incurred. That should be provided to the requesting party and list all of the charges expected to be incurred in retrieving the records. The requester can then elect to proceed with their original request, narrow their request, or cancel it in response to the estimate. Estimates should be provided in good faith, not too high to discourage requests, and also not too low to later pursue a collection action. Advance payments may also be required of some or all of the estimated cost prior to providing any records, and if the estimate exceeds the actual cost, you are required to refund the difference. Just summarizing, fees need to ensure that fee collection practices comply with the statute and any internal FOIA policy, and also ensure that fees are assessed reasonably under the Act. And coming up next is Deputy Attorney General Carla Jarvis.
Sorry to have to do this, everyone, but I'm significantly shorter than my fellows. Sorry about that. Yes, I'm Deputy Attorney General Carla Jarvis, and I'll be talking to you today about executive sessions, with beginning with a short overview of open meetings. All meetings of a public body must be open to the public unless specifically exempted in the FOIA statute, and that's where the executive session comes in. If a topic is specifically exempted, then a public body may go into that executive session. Now, a meeting has been defined as a formal or informal gathering of a quorum of members of a public body for the purposes of discussing or taking action on public business, either in person or by video conferencing. It is required by public bodies to provide both notice and maintain minutes of all meetings. That's open and executive. Now, notice is going to include the time, date, and place of the meeting and whether video conferencing will be used. Notice needs to be given 7 days in advance unless there is an emergency. An emergency is defined as something that requires the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, or safety. A notice needs to also include a preliminary agenda. The agenda must include whether executive sessions are going to be held and the exemption for which this executive session is going to be held. Now, a catch-all category in your agenda for either the executive session or for any other agenda item is generally considered not permissible. You need to give the public notice, actual notice about what's going to happen at your meeting. Now, executive minutes of meetings, every meeting, including the executive session, you need to take minutes. Statute requires that minutes include a record of the members present, each vote taken, and each action agreed upon. Practically speaking, you are not taking votes or actions inside of executive session. You can have the conversation inside of executive session, then you need to close the executive session, go back into the public open meeting, and have your vote there. If you're going to include any other additional information in your minutes, it is important that those minutes not be misleading to the public. If your vote is unanimous, then the minutes must state how each member unless your vote is unanimous, minutes must state how each member voted and note abstentions and recusals. As a matter of good public policy, we recently had a Delaware Attorney General opinion explore this issue in which we had members of the public body sitting in the executive session that they eventually recused themselves. Just for optics and good policy, those members should actually try and recuse themselves from that executive session and remove themselves from the room entirely. Those executive session minutes may be withheld from public disclosure, but only so long as the public disclosure would defeat the lawful purpose for the executive session. But then they must become public. So for example, if the reason for your executive session is a site acquisition, when you get the site acquired, you can then release those minutes to the public. Calling an executive session. In order to call an executive session, you need to convene an open meeting, then have a motion stating the reason for executive session. Now this motion doesn't need to be very detailed, but it should include what exemption you are using to go into the executive session. Again, you need to limit your discussion in the executive session to that FOIA exemption itself and not stray into discussion of other things that should properly be discussed in your open meeting. And finally, no voting in executive session. You need to close this executive session, move to the public, open meeting, and vote there. The reasons with which you can call an executive session are you're going to discuss an individual citizen's qualifications to hold a job or pursue training. This exemption is frequently confused with another one regarding personnel matters when the names, competencies, and abilities of individual employees or students are discussed. You can also hold an executive session if you're going to discuss site acquisitions for publicly funded capital improvements or the sale, leases of real property, law enforcement agencies' efforts to collect information leading to criminal apprehension, so the investigations. You have discussions of anonymous charitable contributors. You also have student disciplinary cases or employee disciplinary cases unless the student or employee requests that an open meeting be convened. Strategy sessions, including seeking legal advice, but only if that discussion would have, if done in an open forum, would have an adverse effect on the public body's collective bargaining or litigation position. And then finally, this is discussion of non-public documents. Yes?
How could you give attorney-client privileged legal advice in an open session?
You know what, it is a sticky situation, because you'll find that a lot of public bodies have their attorneys sitting in on the open meetings. But basically, that attorney is making a decision on whether their legal advice is going to have an adverse effect on the public body if done in the open setting. Make sense?
Right, but wouldn't you be violating privilege?
Well, you know what? It has been found to be a difficult situation that we just have to live with. Fortunately, I don't have any. So the final reason you would call an executive session is a discussion of non-public documents. Now, what public documents is defined in the statute, and then there's a list of 19 exemptions for what is considered a non-public document. In the past, we've taken time during this training to go through all of those exemptions, but we are not going to do that today. So it is outside the realm. However, if you have any non-fact specific questions about a public record or a non-public record, I encourage you to ask them during our question and answer section. And finally, executive session attendees. Now, The attendees of an executive session are going to be necessarily the board members or the public body. And there are exemptions in FOIA for individuals that are necessary to the decision making or the reason that the executive session is open. Those people are allowed to come in and give information that's necessary for the public body. However, there should not be outside observers, nor should there, as a matter of practice, be public body members or board members that have or will recuse themselves from the discussion within the room during the executive session. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you, this year, we are doing a FOIA Coordinators panel. We have 4 very esteemed FOIA coordinators to come talk to you about their practice, how they manage the world of FOIA on a day-to-day basis. They are C.R. McLeod, Dan Shortridge, Lee Sobietsky, and Andrea Wojcik. So I will have them I will ask them to come up along with their moderators, Deputy Attorneys General Dan Mulvaney and Jameson Tweedy. Come on up, everyone. Now, Jameson, there's only 5 chairs, so we figured one of you, either you or Dan, would.
Got 6 chairs. Pick it on.
Yeah, that's fine. Have a seat, get comfortable. Come on up. Dan, there's another one over here. It is. This is going to be helpful to you or not.
Shut off the So thank you for that nice introduction. I've never been to this meeting, this presentation before in years past, so this is all new to me. But I understand that this format is also something new, so hopefully people will find it useful and helpful, and sort of a different way to get some information out of this experience. Perfect. Thank you.
Nobody needed it.
So as pertains to the whole training, we can't answer legal questions about FOIA, which is odd, given that the point is to teach about FOIA. But hopefully this format, talking to a bunch of people who have practical experience dealing with FOIA, can be a useful way to answer some of the more substantive practical questions. So, first introductions, I'm Jameson Tweedy. I am Deputy Attorney General assigned to the Environmental Unit at the DOJ. I have only been with the DOJ about 6 months, and I practiced in private practice for about a decade prior to that. Maybe we'll start at the far end.
So,
Dan Mulvaney.
I'm Deputy Attorney General Daniel Mulvaney. Also, I'm in the Civil Division, Affirmative Litigation Boards and Commissions Unit. My primary role is General Counsel to the Board of Unemployment Insurance Appeal Board.
I'm Lisa Psinski. I'm with DENREC, the FOIA Coordinator for DENREC. My experience, I've been with DENREC since June, but I was previously at the DOJ since 2012. And in that capacity, I was helping to review FOIA responses. And now, as I said, I'm the coordinator for DENREC.
Hi, I'm Andrea Wojcik. I'm the head of Division of Public Health Communications. I have 6 years experience with FOIA, most recently in my time in the last 3 years with public health, although I just handed it over to somebody else, gleefully, as I moved up to section chief. And then previously I had 3 years of FOIA experience as the community relations coordinator for the Department of Services for Children, Youth, and Families.
Can I ask you guys pull the mics a little closer and share them? Thank you.
I'm Dan Shortridge. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Sussex Technical School District. I have worked with FOIA and public records topics throughout the last 20 years. Filed my first federal FOIA request when I was in college. Worked on both sides of the fence as a working journalist for about 11 years. And I've been a FOIA coordinator for the last 4 to 5 years with the Department of Agriculture, the State Housing Authority, and now with Sussex Tech School District.
Hi everyone, I'm C.R. McLeod. I'm the Director of Community Relations for the Delaware Department of Transportation, and I've served as the Manager of Public Affairs and also as the Foia Coordinator with DelDOT for the past 2 years. Previously, I worked with the Department of State and served as Foia Coordinator there, and then also at a local level working with Newcastle County government as well. So, broad background of interesting Foia experiences.
And that was part of our goal, was to get a panel that had different experiences from different angles, including Lee, who's been on the paralegal end as well as now Foia Coordinator, but a bunch of different agencies, different size agencies, different Foia expectations from those agencies. So we're going to try and talk about a variety of topics that hopefully are interesting and useful, and then there'll be a question and answer session at the end where you're welcome to ask questions that hopefully are either appropriate, okay, or we can answer, and the other members of the DOJ who are here for training and presented earlier are also here and available to answer where we can. So the first topic I wanted to start with is that Foia coordinators sort of span this interesting and somewhat unusual role that was mentioned in the presentation before, where they have responsibility not only for responding to FOIA requests and helping to find the information, but there's also an obligation in there to facilitate between the requesting party and the agency, and to help the requesting party identify records, which sort of puts them in an unusual position of working for their agency and handling their FOIA responsibilities, but also having an obligation to facilitate with the requesting party. So that sort of dual role of interfacing with the requesting party, but also having a responsibility and needing the buy-in from your own agency is an interesting one. So we could start with Andrea and Lee. My first question is, how, in your experience, do you go about working to get good cooperation and buy-in from your agency, the staff you work with, and people you may not even know but then need to seek records from?
Okay, I can start. So at Public Health, we think that good cooperation really begins at the top. So whenever we get a FOIA request that comes in, we have a system set up to triage out those requests. And every request we send out, if it doesn't directly go to a section chief, which is what our program leads are known as, then they're copied on the request that goes to the staff member. And if it's a staff member that we've never worked with on FOIA before, we explain to them and we include in the request that we forward to them the deadline by which they need to respond. I would say that a key facet of this job is don't wait until the day before something is due to check with your staff. If it's something that you see that is going to be, they're going to send a lot of records, or if you've got some holidays coming up like we've had this week and have next week, go back to them a couple of days in advance and make sure that they know that this deadline is looming, and you just want to make sure that they are on track with providing you what you need by the deadline in which you need it.
And I would say we handle our requests pretty similar to that. We send it out to what we call our division designees. And let me backtrack for a minute. I started in June. The process was decentralized. Everyone was handling it separately. So now it is centralized in my office, and actually the division designees, as we call them, were very happy to have it taken off of their plate. They help get the documents to me, but they don't have to deal with the requester, and then, like I said, it's all centralized. So I have really gotten fabulous buy-in, but the request initially goes to the division designees, and we do copy the directors with whichever division we're sending it to.
And just following up on that, Lee, I mean, one of the issues that you were confronting at DENREC is that DENREC has 8 different divisions. All of these requests were coming through the different divisions and were being handled separately and tracked separately. So part of what you're now trying to do is bring all of that into one place where it can all be coordinated.
That's correct, and we're still finding there's people who, requesters who dealt directly with somebody and they want to still deal directly with that person, they will send it to them, but all of our folks now know to forward it on to us so that it can be tracked within our system and then handled as we've been handling them going forward. So, like I said, we've had really great buy-in from the folks.
And I just want to follow up and say that we have more of a centralized system. We've had all of the requests come into the communications office to the Foia coordinator who's located there. And if it happens to go to an outside staff member, they're aware that they need to forward it to the communications office. And while we triage it out to the sections to request the information, they send everything back to us. We are the single point of receiving the information and making the response on behalf of the division.
So, related question is, what do you do and how do you handle lack of responsiveness? You outlined some of the things that you try to do to make sure it doesn't happen, but when it does happen, how do you approach that? Do you have any best practices or advice?
We just go right to the supervisors and clearly explain that this is a legal mandate, this isn't a nice to do, and I'm overworked and underwater and simply don't have time to get to this isn't a good enough reason not to give us what we need, because otherwise we're going to be in some legal hot water, and we really try to avoid that.
I start with going back to the division designee, the person who has been requesting or who provides the documents. If I don't get a response from them, or if they're wishy-washy, or I don't have time kind of thing, then I include the division head and the deputy secretary to make sure that we get some response, that the folks are responsive.
Thanks. So, a related question, I'll turn to the other side of the table. When requests come in, how do you handle knowing when to involve your public information officer or other media relations with any particular FOIA request?
First of all, can we get a show of hands? Can everyone who's a FOIA coordinator put their hand up? Okay. Everyone who is also, please keep your hands up there. Everyone who is also a public information officer, put your hand down. Okay, so it looks like the majority of folks who are FOIA coordinators in this room are also not public information officers or communications directors or public relations, which is great. So this is really aimed at those folks. Get to know your PIO. Whatever title they have, whatever area they work in, get to know them well. Best practice, your PIO should always be looped in on all non-routine requests. If you always get the same thing every year from the same requester and it's routine and you know that it's okay to give out, you don't need to loop them in on it. But anything else, no PIO should ever be blindsided or caught unawares by a request at any step in the process. And the PIOs know things and see things and can identify trends and escalate things to agency leadership that they may need to know about. That's my advice on that.
Yeah, I would just assume that it's newsworthy if you're being contacted by a member of the media requesting information. And again, just really take the time to share that with the PIO and others in the leadership of the department as well, just so they're aware of what's being requested and we're able to move forward with putting together the appropriate response in the appropriate amount of time. I think that's a key part of it as well, is that we want to make sure that sometimes they're not simple questions, and we want to make sure that we really get a comprehensive response together, and that may include multiple layers of the department, especially the larger agencies. So my rule of thumb is to always take those requests, to make sure that you're sharing them with the persons who are doing the managing the communications outreach department as well as the senior leadership.
Great, thank you. Touching back on the role of the Foia Coordinator in standing between the requesting party and the agency. So I want to talk a bit about how denials, how you handle denials and your process there. So maybe Dan and then Andrea, can you talk a little bit about your role and when you involve your legal counsel when you're faced with a FOIA request that is either going to be denied or denied in part?
Sure. So my general practice is to involve attorneys in a couple of cases there. First of all, when you're just starting out at the position, when you're brand new, you want to get that extra backup. It's always helpful. Second is when there's a matter of first impression for you, either an exemption that you have not dealt with before, or a type of record you haven't dealt with before, or records with content that you haven't dealt with before. It can always be helpful to get an attorney's feedback on that. You want to loop your attorney in when there's a denial or a redaction. You absolutely want to have them signing off on that, making sure it's legally within the bounds of the code. And occasionally, it can be useful to loop your attorney in when you just need an extra set of eyes, because there's probably no one else at your agency who does this type of work. So it can be good to get that right perspective. I have also worked with outside counsel, which provides a little bit of a different spin on things, because they generally charge by the hour as opposed to someone from DOJ. You really want to be clear with your agency's leadership and your financial staff on when you're going to reach out to them and under what circumstances. Feel free to ask questions, but keep them concise and targeted. And you may have to do a little more explanation and background with your outside counsel than you do with someone, say from DOJ, who works with your agency more closely on a day-to-day basis.
So I would say the first thing is, if you don't really know your DAG, get to know them, make them your bestie. Joanna, love you. In our office, we send out a daily media log to our leadership staff and key members of our staff. And in that daily media log, it has a list of all the FOIAs that we are working through at the moment. Whatever is new, whatever is open and pending, whatever is closed. So our DAG is on that email list. She gets that daily, so she knows what we're working on in terms of FOIA on a daily basis. If it's something new or something that we have a question about, we'll go to her immediately and ask about whether or not this is something that's going to be denied, so that we don't spend too much time doing the legwork. Otherwise, we gather the documents that we need and loop her in to either review a draft denial or request that she help us in drafting a denial. We don't send any denials out unless we have like 99% certainty that that's going to hold up. That's sort of our personal mantra, the way we work.
So for each of you, what percentage of FOIA requests does your agency typically deny? I know that's a hard thing to estimate, but just sort of a general ballpark. And then do you have any best practices on how to go about those communications, actually communicating the denial back to the requesting party? Let's start with Andrea.
We probably deny maybe 5% of our total FOIA requests, and to put into perspective, we get anywhere between 250 and 300 a year at this point. So 5% or less that we deny. And in terms of communication, it depends. I mean, sometimes we let the requester know up front that this is probably going to be a denial, or we are not sure that they're going to be able to get the records. Or we may wait till closer to the end and do it, but the denials are always done in writing.
I would agree with Andrea on the number there. Typically deny about 90 to produce about 90 to 95% in whole or in part. So some of those may have redactions along with it. Very few are denied outright, and those that we do that I have denied outright in the past are typically very clear cut. It's a personnel file. It's an investigatory file. there's some sort of federal law prohibiting it, or we just don't have that record, you need to go to this agency over here. Best practices, keep things simple and cordial. The requester is already getting bad news, you don't need to make things overly complicated. If the request came in by email, my general practice is to respond by email. I don't need to put out a formal letter on letterhead and mail it to them. Also try to keep things fairly simple in the language of the response letter. You don't necessarily need to lawyer it up. If you need to have citations, stick it in footnotes down at the bottom or hyperlink it, whatever the case may be. But keep it as simple and straightforward as possible.
Great, thanks. And I should say, Lee or CR, on any of these questions, if you want to jump in, please feel free.
Since I'm new, I send everything to legal probably ad nauseum, but I just need for me to have that, okay, check, yes, that's valid denial, or have more of a discussion, since it is a learning experience for me.
And I would think the majority of the denials that we issue are requests for personally identifiable information. I think that's a very predominant one that we get asked for, especially DMV records, for example. That's just not information that we are, legally allowed to share. So, I think that's one where we always make sure that we have a clear-cut reason for that denial, and we state that. We make sure we cite the section of code and the reason why we're denying it, so that there's no questions. We don't want there to be any areas of gray. We want to keep it very black and white. That we're abiding by the rules as they're set forth.
So, along that vein of wanting to comply with the rules, one of the other things, and the presentation went through it, are all the specifically required things that need to be in a FOIA log. So maybe Dan, can you comment on the importance of a FOIA log in your world, and how you typically handle it, how regularly you update it, what level of detail you put in it?
Sure. So keeping the FOIA log, it's not a hard thing to do, but it can be time consuming. Can be a real pain in the butt, especially if you put things off for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and then have to go back and try to reconstruct it. Not that I'm speaking from personal experience. So best advice is to just keep it up to date as you go along, enter those things into your log. Executive branch agencies in Delaware use a standard Excel spreadsheet with a standard format. I recreated that when I came down to the school district. It's just a nice, easy to use, simply formatted thing where you can tell at a glance. If you have lots of requests going on, you can use color coding, for example, to tell what stages they're at there. And I always try to provide more detail than is required for my own information. I have a notes column where I summarize or describe what was provided and mention anything that was redacted, just so I can go back if I need to and kind of instantly tell that without going to the actual files. And I copy and paste the actual text of the request rather than trying to summarize it, just so when I go back to that log, that is my reference for those types of things there. One piece of advice gained from experience is that when you have a very complex or potentially contentious or controversial request, one that you think may end up getting appealed to DOJ or go to the courts, is to keep your own timeline, separate from the log, but just keep a day-by-day timeline of what you did when. That can become especially helpful if you have to go back and try to justify why it took so long for your agency to produce these certain records or to process this request. If you can document that you did something every day on this request, and that it's a good faith effort there, that will be helpful to you in that appeal. And it's much easier to have that as you go along than try to go back and reconstruct weeks or months later from emails or personal notes.
And with that latter timeline you're discussing, I mean, that's not part of the formal requirements of FOIA, just a sort of useful practice that you
Exactly,
found
just a useful practice that can help you if you're dealing with a contentious situation.
And do you have what are the things that tip you off that you have a request that you might want to put this extra effort into a timeline? Are there any sort of particular features that are common?
After you've dealt with requests for a while, you will know them when you see them. That's as specific as I can get on that.
Or the requester, if you've had prior experience with them, then probably take them offline.
James, I had a follow-up question for Dan. In your running and maintaining your log, do you ever insert any attorney advice you receive? I'm sorry. So my question was for Dan, is in keeping his log, does he ever include any of the attorney advice that he gets in the process of handling a request?
Include attorney advice in terms of specifically what our attorney advised us to do. I typically wouldn't do that. If there are redactions, I would just note that there were redactions. If a request is being denied, I'll just note the exact citation for denial.
It's important to note, if I might add, Dan, to your question, FOIA log is a discoverable document, so I would caution against putting too much detail in terms, especially of any legal advice you might get into the FOIA log. Hence, you're going to have to then redact that later on when you get your petition for that FOIA log.
Anything further on that topic?
I'll just add that the FOIA log really serves as a roadmap in our department. Shout out to my Del.Dot team. We have really 3 full-time employees who are managing this. This year already, we're over 300 FOIA requests, which is our most in recent memory. So it really helps us stay on top of them and make sure we're responding within the allotted time, and we're all on the same page with who's doing what and in processing this.
And that raises a sort of a good question, a little bit off topic, but do you have any best practices for staying on top of those deadlines, especially when you have numerous FOIA requests going on at once? Maybe Lee, I don't know if you can chime in on that. I know it's sort of off topic, but.
Absolutely. We've had, since I started, we transitioned effective July 1. To date, we've received over 330 requests, so it's quite busy. So I keep my own little spreadsheet just of knowing the request number, the request name, and who it was sent to, what responses I've received, what I'm waiting for, so that I can know that it includes the due date. So I know this one's delayed, we're all finished with this can be closed out. And then my assistants will manage the FOIA log and updating with when a response is made, or if we're waiting for legal advice or whatever it is. So I have my own little cheat sheet, and then they have the main FOIA log.
Anyone else have any sort of tidbits or ideas on how to keep track of those deadlines?
For us, it's just that I mentioned the daily media log that goes out to staff and includes all the pending FOIAs. That's really our at-a-glance look at what's open and what's pending, and allows us daily to keep track of what we need to be looking at.
Yeah, and for us, it's really very simply good communication, and our staff is very good about saying, hey, we're at day 10, and I haven't heard, I haven't gotten an internal response yet. They're very good about ratcheting it up, getting it on my attention if I need to get deputy secretary or one of the division directors involved. They're very good about watching the clock and making sure that we are doing our due diligence to meet the stated time requirements.
James, can you use the mic?
Can I use the mic too?
Yes,
I
please.
thought I was being loud enough, but okay, we're gonna have to shuttle it back and forth.
Sorry, Al.
All right, changing to the next topic. So the fees for FOIA requests. Maybe we'll start with Andrea and then Dan, and anyone else can chime in if they want to. How does your agency handle seeking fees? For example, do you request payment before providing records, or where in the time, or do you only request payment after the fact? How do you handle that? How do you handle the mechanics of seeking payment? And how do you divide up that responsibility, which is sort of a FOIA coordinator responsibility and sort of has a lot of accounting responsibility?
So for us, if it's something that, per the statute is going to take significantly more than an hour's worth of time, and those are the ones that you look at, this is just gonna take a lot of time. We request a cost estimate from the staff. We explain what it takes from them to help us produce that cost estimate. And then we send the cost estimate to the requester and let them know this is going to require an payment up front. And we advise the staff, do not start working on this request until we have confirmed that we have received the check. Because I don't want you going through all this work only to have the requester come back and say, oh no, I don't want to pay this. So that's the first part. Once they've said we're going to pay this, we actually have a contact in our fiscal office. We let them know, please expect a check with FOIA subject, whatever, in the subject line, in the memo line of the check, and please let us know when you have received it. And once that has occurred, then we can direct the staff to go ahead and pull the documents, and then we'll process it as normal.
Pretty similar to Andrew's process. I'd say I can count on one hand the number of times in the last 4 years where I have charged administrative fees for a FOIA request. Generally speaking, most requests that I've dealt with at my agencies have been fairly simple and straightforward, and it would take more time and more mental energy coming up with the cost estimate than it would to just go ahead and do the 3 to 4 hours of work and provide it. So FOIA has that 1 hour of free time. In reality, it's more like 3 or 4 hours with the majority of standard simple requests. We have charge fees where a request will take significant time away from a program staffer, or where we have to do an email search and work with the IT custodian and have fees that are associated with that charge by another entity. It's kind of a fundamental, and not giving legal advice, kind of a fundamental principle under FOIA that the requester bears the costs. We have an obligation to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, so we have to be on the lookout for that. My best advice is to get complete payment ahead of time and don't begin processing the request until the check clears. I haven't dealt with it directly, but I know of another public body that had a check bounce on them. So it's something you want to avoid at all possible, just going back to that principle of being good stewards of taxpayer dollars.
Great, thank you. And so this next question is to CR. I know DelDOT, I think, is among possibly the only state agency that uses online credit card processing for FOIA requests. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that process, how it got up off the ground, and how it has been implemented so far.
Sure. So, over the past, number of years, as, obviously when requesters are requesting information, and in many instances in our department, it's substantial amounts of information, and there is a fee associated with that. The payment methods is always, sort of the de facto in this day and age is, can I pay over the phone? Can I pay via the web? And up until this year, we did not have that ability. But working with our colleagues in DTI, we were actually able to come up, I think, with a very straightforward web page payment access now, where in our estimation, it's probably saving 3 to 5 days now in terms of getting information out to the requester. So instead of either dropping a check in the mail, or even more inconvenient, having them come in and make a payment, allowing that online payment system, really I think is a big time saver, and not just for the requester, but also for us as an agency in terms of it's all electronic, it's all processed. We're notified as soon as that payment has been processed, and we're able to proceed forward with going ahead and beginning to gather that information. So for us, we think it's a real benefit to both parties in terms of less red tape for us on the as the agency, and then also ensuring that, hey, we're able to turn information around quicker in most instances because we have the online payment system. So we've gotten really good feedback about it. DTI did a great job in implementing that for us, and hopefully it's something that will be implemented statewide at some point as well.
So, and that's awesome, and I think, I'm pretty sure you're on the cutting edge of that, at least as far as state agencies are concerned. But Dan, I know you mentioned sort of the one best practice of not waiting till the check's actually processed, not just in the door. Anyone else have other best practices about anything to do with fees before we move on? Okay, great. So turning to sort of the process of collecting documents, and the first step of identifying the custodians that might have relevant documents. So Dan or CR, can you tell me your process or best practice to try and identify the universe of custodians who might have documents responsive to a request? I know sort of your agency sizes are quite different, so the process may.
Good. So I come from a small agency background of both Department of Agriculture and the State Housing Authority have had about 130 employees total. So it's a little more informal of a process than at DENREC or DelDOT or even Public Health. There's really no magic system that I've come up with. It comes down to relationship building and knowing your agency. I'm a big proponent of working closely with the PIO, or the PIO serving as the Foia Coordinator, because they should know the agency better than anybody outside of the top leadership. They can be a really good resource for you in helping figure out which small branch or office might touch this issue there. I would say a couple pieces of advice: be a presence if you can at division director or section head meetings. Report on Foia. As Andrea said, you can do a weekly Foia report, just to keep Foia at the top of mind of your leadership there. Understand what things your agency does. Ask questions proactively and preemptively about the different roles and divisions and sections that you have. And have good personal relationships with people outside of the Foia process. That is really key. The number one piece of advice is to make friends with your agency's administrative assistants, because they can absolutely make or break your day when it comes to a Foia request.
And I echo the sentiments really that Dan shared. One of the things that I'll add is, we're in a time where we're seeing a lot of employees, we're seeing a lot of long tenured state employees retire as well. And we're seeing new employees come in, which is a great thing. Helping new employees understand the importance of the Foia process. That this is something that we have to abide by this. And their cooperation and input on that is essential to helping us ensure that we are not violating the statute. So really it's helping that education process for all of our employees. We have nearly 2,000 employees, so understanding where we have multiple divisions, obviously DART, DMV as well. Really, just sometimes it's almost like a treasure hunt. You just got to kind of lay out the map of, okay, this is referencing this issue. This issue falls under this umbrella. Who are the appropriate people to reach out to? Again, after having done it, for a long period of time, our team has gotten really good at knowing who the go-to people are as well. So again, but making sure the employees understand we're not unnecessarily nagging you or trying to give you extra work. We're trying to abide by the state rules and regulations in terms of providing freedom of information. So that's really one of the critical parts of it for us.
Yeah.
So just a follow-up question. In what time in the process do you try to figure out who the best custodians would be? I direct it to you, CR.
Sure. I really, when we receive it. As soon as we were, that clock ticks fast. 15 business days. It seems like a lot, but in most instances, it is not a lot of time. So, we try to address them, if not the day they come in, within 24 hours of reception, and identify, okay, first, does it meet all of the necessary requirements for us to respond to? Do we have this information? Once we're able to sort of say, okay, we need to move forward and get this going, we work together as a team to say, okay, here's the person or persons that need to be notified about this. So again, we want to make sure that we're meeting the 15-day deadline or exceeding that, but also making sure we're giving the people that have this information sufficient time to fulfill the request. Again, they're not just waiting for us to call and give them work to do. They're obviously balancing their day-to-day work as well. So, we're very sensitive to ensuring that we identify who we need to get the information from and bringing them into the loop, discussing the issue with them, and really setting our path forward.
Thank you for that. And it just occurred to me that we moved on from fees, and there had been a question about fees earlier in the presentation. If memory serves, the question was where multiple requests are sort of being done piecemeal and therefore potentially flirting with the fee threshold or not. And so that is addressed in the statute, which is at 10003 M2, where it says when multiple FOIA requests are submitted by or on behalf of the requesting party in an effort to avoid incurring administrative charges, the public body may, in its discretion, aggregate staff time for all such requests when computing fees hereunder. So hopefully that at least directs that question to the right part of the statute, and I think that's as far as we're allowed to say anything. All right, document collection. So, very basic question. How does your agency collect documents? Maybe we'll go Andrea, Lee, and then Dan.
Well, I think I've kind of talked a little bit about our process. We get the request in, we send the request to the appropriate section. And sometimes, I think one of the important things to do is to make sure that the FOIA coordinator really understands what the person is asking for before they send it to the section, because sometimes you need to clearly lay it out for the staff member what they're searching for, in terms of all documents. Well, all documents means email, hard copy, might mean emails. The other thing is, if you have any question, go back to the requester and ask for clarification. You can do that, say, okay, you've asked for this, is there a specific time frame that you're looking for this information for? Or you can say, well, hey, by the way, we had a similar request. This is what, based on the last request, we know that we're going to be able to provide. Is that going to meet your needs? Because if not, they might choose to withdraw the FOIA. But we go ahead and send the documents out to staff for them to begin to pull it, and then they send it back to us. The FOIA coordinator in our office reviews the documents to see if there are any initial redactions that are obvious or any reason that we see for denial. And then we, in a lot of cases, do send it to our DAG for review if we have any questions at all.
Our process is pretty much the same. We receive the request, we review it, determine which division or divisions it needs to go to, and then send it out, send our internal email, research email out, and wait for the responses. Fortunately, probably 90% of our requests are of a particular type, and so they're very quickly responded to. It's the other 10% that might take a little bit more time or more thought and more effort. So, but for the most part, it's just the same thing that Andrea said.
Working for a smaller agency, a lot of times the process is a lot more informal. It's as simple as just walking down the hallway, knocking on someone's door, and saying, "Hey, can I pick your brain about this?" and figure out, who the right person is to handle this, what office handles this.
And then for each of you, do you have any process or tidbits or checks to make sure that you're getting a complete set of documents when you do go?
Again, we go back to the initial request, and because the FOIA coordinator is the person who responds to the requester, we take the responsibility to make sure that it's the information that we're providing to them is what they asked for, as long as it's legally allowable. So you just have to go through and double check and make sure. But the onus is on the staff pulling those documents to make sure that they are pulling everything that they're supposed to be pulling and giving that information to you. There's no way to know what you don't know in some cases. You can't absolutely guarantee that every email has been included. You just do your best that you can to make sure that the staff member understands what you're looking for out of this request.
And again, I agree with Andrea. Like I said, 90% of ours are standard, and so we know that we're receiving their full file. It's the other 10% that might need legal review or a discussion with that group, that division, just to ensure that we're getting everything that is related to that request.
I would say that the big thing is just to talk to people, both at the outset when you get a request and when you get the records back. I often play dumb. My teenager would say that I'm not playing, but I will say, so just so I understand, can you walk me through this again? Can you help me make sure that I'm understanding what we do, not just understanding the records, but understanding what we do in the context of this particular record set or information. A lot of times when you're working with program staff, their viewpoint may be a little bit narrow or limited. If they're used to working, let's say we get a request about all records about a particular incident, and they have a standard report that they fill out and complete about that incident. Their initial inclination may be to hand you that report and say, here you go, this is what I've got on it. Well, the request was for all records, so let's sit down and talk about. That may include emails, that may include voicemails, meeting notes, faxes, lab results. It could include any number of things. So what about those records? Let's sit down and talk about them. And that kind of brings it down off of a confrontational level. You're not asking them to justify their work. You're not digging into what they do. You're just trying to have a conversation about how they do it, what they do it, and what records are going to come out of that. And it's not a bad faith or malicious response. It's just a lack of understanding on the program staff on what FOIA requires. So just asking lots of questions and trying to get lots of answers.
So in the circumstance where you are identifying documents and realize that that archives or archived documents may come into play, how do you handle that process? When do you know to look for things in archives? And what's your experience in trying to track down hard copy archive documents? Maybe Lee or Dan?
Well, I haven't actually had to go to archives for the records. We have, a lot of records are online, and they are in the process of getting the rest of the records online. So, for instance, our tank section has a lot of paper files. So they will have to go to the paper file and they will either, if it's a small file, they will scan it and make it available for the requester. If it's a large file, they will request that the requester come in. There was a situation where someone was in Missouri and couldn't come in but wanted the documents, so they paid to have us scan it and make it available to them. But for the most part, our records are either in PDF format already or online somewhere, and we just send out a link.
And in those cases where you have either large hard copy files that aren't yet electronic, or large format files that are hard copy, those are the circumstances where you need to have someone come in and look at them or?
That's correct, especially because, in our tank section, the records could be from 1983, onion skin paper, so it's not just scanning it, sending it through a scanner, it's a paper at a time type of thing.
I would say with archived documents, the key thing is to know your agency's records retention schedule. That's crucially important. Make sure you're following that. Work with your agency's records retention officer to make sure you're on top of that. And is anyone here from State Archives or Department of State? Okay, wonderful. The archive staff really, there's some great unheralded state employees who really deserve a great round of applause. Get to know your archives liaison. I think they're records analysts. There's a list on the archives website under the government services section. Take them out for a cup of coffee, have them explain how their processes work, so that when you get into a situation where you do have to go back 5 or 10 or 15 years into the archives, you have a good working relationship already, and that process goes a lot more smoothly.
Yeah, just from personal experience, just on Monday, I was searching for something from 2 decades ago that I had no idea even where to begin, and contact someone in archives and had it, within a day. So they work miracles.
James,
Yeah.
I just had a follow-up question for open to anyone on the panel. And from my experience in civil litigation, there's an area of documents that sometimes are called not reasonably accessible that are still discoverable, but you've got to justify the request. Does that ever happen in the context of FOIA?
Comes to mind.
Yeah.
Question.
So the question was, are there any records retention requirements to the FOIA requests themselves, like the request that's coming in or the production that's going out?
Yeah, so like if you have a FOIA database, how far back do you have to keep the records of the FOIA request? And then if you've had to produce redacted documents, how long would you keep that FOIA request and redacted documents? Is there any record retention requirements on that?
I do not know the answer.
I actually think it's 2 years for most requests, and then for those that are denial or could potentially go to litigation, it's 6 years.
Yeah.
Have any of you had to deal with text message requests yet? And if so, how have you handled them?
I'd like to dovetail on that because you had mentioned voicemails, so I'll throw that one in as well.
Can you repeat the questions before you answer? Can't
Yeah.
hear.
So the questions were, have any of the panelists had experience with either requests for text messages or voicemails?
So we have had requests before, and it's my understanding that they have been deemed not accessible. So for instance, for text messages, you would have to go through your state cell carrier, Verizon, to get them, and Verizon isn't willing to give those up without a subpoena.
Just a very brief experience with text. It was a simple matter of walking down the hallway to our cabinet secretary and saying, hey, did you exchange text messages with this person during this last year? They said yes, took some screenshots, sent them off, and that was fine. Not a really complicated request.
And I don't believe I have experience with voicemails.
There's another question in the back.
This is my first time attending, and I realize that some people are here multiple years, so I apologize. But in a fast-growing agency, and I just wonder, what are if you could comment on the top 5 mistakes or offenses that DOJ most commonly sees, and anything that you might have recommendations to prevent that in the future. And I was briefly looking through this Hall of Fame, Hall of Shame thing we have ready, and while it's interesting, a lot of times it just says recommendation FOIA training. So I'm wondering though, a number of us who are not the FOIA administrator in our organization, administrative members though, and or board members, is there a resource, something online that you might recommend that we look at, that we can better inform ourselves so that we do a better job?
So I'll start with the caveat that we can't answer any legal questions, so there's that. But on the Department of Justice website, earlier there's the FOIA Policy Manual. So that is a fairly good resource. It goes through the entire statute, has some discussion points on all of the different pieces.
Can we go to a hypothetical? I'm not asking you to name names. I'm just asking you to discuss categories of problematic areas. I mean, you're making this so challenging that people like myself who are not administrators in that issue, I mean, I'm never going to be able to better inform myself if you're constantly referring me to more and more statutes and
So, well, I've only been with the Department of Justice for 6 months, so, and what we do is we do our best to advise state agencies who are having to respond to FOIA. So if you're with a state agency, please contact your DAG, and if you're not, then your relevant legal counsel. This is the statute that the General Assembly has passed, and is a matter of policy and statute, and the best we can do is try and give some training. So, you know, we are trying to do the best we can to sort of go through and help you with some of the basics, and to try and provide context for how other agencies are handling it. I'm not sure I can give sort of specific. Yes. So and we have another, you know, section of our panel discussion that we're hoping to get through, and then have a question and answer at the end. So unless there are sort of questions that are directly relevant to the topic we were on, I might want to ask you to just hold the questions. We can have a free-form question and answer at the end once we get through the panel discussion. So the topic we were on was collecting records and differences between electronic and hard copy documents. And so maybe Dan and CR, if you could just give any guidance you might have on best practices for dealing with collecting or searching for electronic records or emails, working with DTI or other vendors if you have any experience in that, and any guidance you have on sort of the tricks that come with having to craft search terms and queries.
Yeah, for us, it really comes down to being very clear about the scope and understanding working with the requester to drill down as much as possible into what exactly they're looking for. Find that to be very helpful in narrowing down what terms we need to search for, and collecting that information. I think a lot of times if we're dealing with someone who may not submit FOIAs on a regular basis, it's a new process for them as well, and they're learning. So really, in the Foia Coordinator role, helping them understand, okay, if we search this term, we're likely going to get, such a massive volume that I don't think this is actually what you're looking for. So, really trying to work with them and say, okay, let's narrow this down. Let's find exactly what you're after here. A time frame, if that applies as well. And in many cases, I think we're able to end up in a better place from where that initial request is, and we make sure that we document that as well. So we were, if the terms of that FOIA change, we're noting that. So again, we're able to come back and say, yeah, we did. The request was modified, and we did fulfill that modified request as well. So again, it's good communication, working with the requester, whoever whether it's a member of the media, a member of the general public, just trying to help them understand the wealth of information that we have, and how do we narrow that scope down enough where they're also not incurring a huge expense. That's something we're sensitive to as well. We want to make sure that, hey, we want to help you do this, but we also have to be sensitive to the time constraints of the process.
First of all, is anybody from DTI here? Okay, wonderful. So what, I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds on email searches, and if anything I say contradicts your current practice, please stick your hand up and let me know. So I've not had to deal with a lot of email requests, but those that I have had to deal with have scarred me enough that that this is kind of ingrained in my memory. In my experience, there are three. So I think there was a suggested step slide for email searches. In practical point of view, there are really three places you need to check for emails. Number one is in your individual user's email box. Go in through Outlook, do a search there. Number two is locally archived emails, and that's a really important thing. Not everyone realizes that when that little automatic archive tool comes up, it saves things outside of your inbox. That saves them as PST files, and they are not searchable by using regular Outlook. You have to open each one up individually and go into them. And then the third is anything that's archived within DTI or your IT custodian. So really three separate places to look there. Make sure you're hitting all three of them. Whether it's you, whether it's the individual user hitting those first two, really make sure that you cover your bases there. Sierra mentioned keywords, and I agree with them wholeheartedly. That's where that facilitator role comes in. You really need to make it clear to the requester that the keywords that you select are what's going to be searched for. Okay, there is no magic tool for us to identify anything beyond those keywords. And you need to also account for misspellings and typos and acronyms and abbreviations. If you're searching for OSHA, what if somebody's finger slipped and they wrote PSHA, for example? That can come up quite often. William instead of Bill, or Bill instead of William. There's a variety of variations that you need to think and account for. And you really need to make sure that your requester is fully on board with those keywords and fully understands that process. I've dealt with a requester once who tried to push that off on me to make the decision on the keywords, and I said, no. I'm not making the decision. This is your request. You need to be specific. I'll work with you on these, and I made some suggestions, but they absolutely need to understand that they're the ones responsible for this keyword list, and that's the only way that their searches are going to come up.
Awesome, thank you. So a tangentially related topic is occasions when a request seeks information that's in a database. Dan or anyone, do you have experience in trying to deal with databases and how, along the lines of what you're just talking about, and working with the requester to get the right keyword searches, in working with them to actually get the information they want, not just maybe information that may not be usable to them from a database?
You go ahead.
For database requests, and I think there needs to be a distinction right off the bat between a database and a spreadsheet. A lot of times what a requester wants is a spreadsheet. They want the information in an Excel file or in CSV format where they have rows and columns and cells, and they can sort and use formulas and all that good stuff to work with that. What a lot of agencies use are databases, commercially available software packages that use this data in a proprietary format. Sometimes you can export a database's data into a spreadsheet, but it's not always possible. And that needs to be made very crystal clear to the requester as soon as you realize that. And it goes back to knowing your agency and knowing the records there. We had back when I was a reporter, I had the misconception of thinking that PIOs in particular had all these databases at their fingertips, and they could press a button and spit out all these magical reports. And I've since apologized to a couple PIOs that I've worked with since then, because it just doesn't work like that. PIOs, Foia Coordinators don't have that level of power. You've got to work with your program staff on that. One case that I worked with was with a journalist. They wanted a spreadsheet exported from a database. We did it. We did the export, but the spreadsheet was completely unusable in that format. The data was meant to be used in the database, not in the spreadsheet. We provided it to them, and we told them up front, even before we provided it, this isn't going to work for you. This isn't going to get you what you want. We even brought them in and sat them down with some of our program staff to try to explain the spreadsheet to them. And our staff sat there and kind of scratched their heads and said, we don't know what this means. Because the database, when it did the export, was producing cells and columns that were internal to it. So we weren't trying to hide anything, but the requester's expectations over here, there was a gap with our reality over here, and so we had to try to bridge that and make that clear right off the bat. So those requests require a lot of work, and a lot of it falls on the Foia Coordinator to do that.
Anything else to add?
Again, I think a big source of frustration that we often come across is we'll get requested data sets from in our databases, while we may have the information, we may not have it compiled the way they're looking for it, and helping them understand that it's not just as easy as us pushing a button and generating that report. I think is a sense of frustration in many instances for a requester. So it does take some education to help them understand how our databases are set up. And again, trying to play the role of facilitator, saying, okay, I think I know what you're trying to get here. Are there other ways that we can do this that will meet your needs? So again, it's not always a very cut and dry process. There's many different databases that we use throughout the agency. So really, it's a matter of how can we reasonably try and meet this request without taking on a tremendous burden at the same time. So again, it's really trying to best understand what's being asked for, and if we don't have that information, is there a reasonable way that we're able to at least put something together that will give them what they're looking for.
And it seems like a theme that we've come back to again and again is sort of that upfront and communication with the requesting party whenever there might be something that potentially could be a source of misunderstanding or confusion. So turning to sort of our final large topic is the general topic of confidentiality and redactions. So maybe we could start this question with Lee, and then Dan or anyone else who wants to chime in. But what process do you use to either identify potentially confidential information, for example, information that has been submitted by a third party intending to be confidential that is now within your agency? So how do you either track or identify that, and any sort of practices that you've learned in how to deal with that?
Well, there's a couple of levels with the confidentiality. Of course, there's the PII, social security number, the stuff that's easily identifiable, and I typically will redact that information, saving a clean copy and then having the redacted version. I have had a number of instances where recently with the request for RFPs, where some of the vendors who submitted their documents request certain things to be confidential. Or the person who was managing the RFP process will go to the vendors, ask if they need anything redacted or held as confidential. They let us know what they would like to have held confidential, and then it's reviewed typically by the legal department to determine if it is a valid request or not. With our new ECM database where they're getting everything scanned in electronically, they are going to have confidential sections, things that are upfront confidential or redacted versions of documents. So that's going to be hopefully already in process, and so that additional step won't need to be made other than maybe just a verification that it's a valid redaction. But hopefully that would be up front before it's even scanned into the system.
My next question was gonna be on requests for proposals or other procurement type information. I think you sort of touched on that, where one of the options that a FOIA coordinator has is to go back to the person who requested this to be confidential in the first place, let them know that a FOIA request has come that's requesting this information, and then try and make sure that whatever goes out the door complies both with your FOIA obligations and any other confidentiality obligations that your agency has.
Yeah, and overall, I think the RFP process is not the whole process, but the upfront process of determining what is confidential is kind of changing a little bit because of a lot of times the vendor wants everything redacted, but that's not a valid request. So it goes through the legal process of determining what should be redacted and what should not in the RFP process or the grant process.
Great.
And then sort of to dovetail on that, when I was at my first state agency, we did run into that where people who had bid on a certain proposal came back on the back end and wanted to see everybody else's proposal, and then you get into the situation where, the successful bidder wanted XYZ redacted. So what we started doing was, when we wrote the RFP in the first place, we outlined it clearly that, be advised that while you may indicate some things on your proposal to be confidential, upon subsequent legal review, in the event of a FOIA, it may not actually be deemed confidential. So we set that expectation up in the RFP at that time. So they're aware and they're not surprised on the back end. It doesn't mean that it's going to be any different outcome, it just means that they're aware in the beginning.
Thanks, that's a great point. So last general question is, what are your best practices or guidance on how to prepare redactions and the process of actually implementing redactions or reviewing redactions, identifying what materials should be redacted? So I'll start with Dan, and then Lee, or anyone else who wants to jump in.
Sure. So this is kind of one of those nuts and bolts type of topics, getting deep into the weeds on it. My opinion, not only opinion, just personal opinion, there are two people who should be doing any redactions of documents, and that's you as the FOIA coordinator or your attorney. My advice is don't delegate that to your program staff, simply because they don't know the code. They don't know the exemptions, they may not be applying them properly. Now, if you have a lot of documents in a standard format that have the same information that needs to be redacted, like a social security number on the same page of every form, then you can delegate that to a trusted administrative assistant or something like that who can carry that out. But if there's anything involving judgment calls or close reading of documents or interpretation of the code, as the FOIA coordinator, my eyes are going on that, and I'm the one making that call in consultation with our attorney. You can see a lot of highly confidential stuff in this type of job, and it's your responsibility to make sure that you're complying with the code and redacting what you're obligated to redact under the law. As far as how to actually redact it, magic markers don't work anymore. The process that I use is a little bit of overkill to some people, but I will take a file, whether it's a hard copy or electronic file, I will put it in a PDF form. I will redact it in Acrobat. They have a good redaction tool there. Use little black bars over it, just like you're using a marker, only it's impenetrable if you hold it up to the light. Once I have that document redacted in Acrobat, I will save a new version, print an entirely new document, and then rescan that printed document. So that way it is a flat PDF, a flat file. Someone more skilled than I in Acrobat cannot go through and peek under the redactions or strip those away. When I'm working with an Excel spreadsheet, for example, a lot of times I will copy and paste all of the cells into a brand new spreadsheet, just so there's no prior version information or anything else that someone can get into if it was sent by the program section. Some people say it's overkill. I'll say, yeah, it probably is, and it is time consuming, but I would rather me spend the time up front than have someone's personal identifiable information or other confidential information go out into the world on an email with my name attached to it.
anyone else want to jump on that? Okay. So that was all of our general topics. Before we wrap up that part, any other best practices, lessons you've learned in your experience of Foia coordinators? Anything else that's
My best piece of advice is don't take FOIA personally. A lot of staff will, but if you can actually act more like your legal counsel and come at it with an analytic legal mind as opposed to a personal mind, you'll be a lot better. In most cases, people aren't trying to get you or your agency. Yeah, sure, there are some cases where they are. But if you go into it with the open mind of, okay, let's give them as much as they can as opposed to let's see what we can hold back, it makes the whole process of processing the FOIAs a lot easier and less stressful.
great? Anyone?
For us, it's really, for every FOIA that's getting ready to go out the door, we have a two-level sign-off procedure where both our DAG will sign off on it, and then also myself as the coordinator will sign off on it, review and sign off before anything goes out the door. That way we're all aware that this is it's accurate. Whether it's redactions, the information being provided, it's had multiple eyes on it, and again we feel very comfortable with if this were elevated to the Attorney General's office for whatever reason, that we've done our due diligence and followed the rule of the law to the T. So
Great. Well, thank you all. So as mentioned, we'll pivot to question and answer session. We're up here. The presenters who presented earlier are also here. So feel free to ask any questions with caveats that we can't give legal advice. And so some topics and some questions we're just not going to be able to answer and are more appropriate for your own legal counsel. But with those caveats, any other caveats I should add?
Nope, fire away.
Anyway, so questions are welcome.
I just had a comment. I've been coming for about 5 years, and I love this format. It's been very useful and helpful to me. Very small organizations, so I get maybe 3 a year, which actually makes it scarier because when you get them, you're thinking, oh my God. So it's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
This is actually hypothetical, I have a construction meeting that's taking place in a public building, meeting with vendors and contractors to go over a scope of work. An individual from the public wants to attend the meeting to find out what we're discussing. This is not a formal body, but I'm the head of a department. Do I have the authority to say that I'm under a FOIA or freedom of information, they have access to that meeting?
So I'm going to punt that to someone who knows open meeting better than I do.
Well, you know what, that is a very fact-specific question for you, so that's probably not something that we're going to be able to answer. I would just say that the definition of a meeting is a formal or informal gathering of a forum of the public body. And that happens, it's open to the public. So, but beyond that, I would consult individual counsel.
Right back.
We talked about a little earlier about in I guess DENREC where they have multiple departments and they have one central person that collects the information or the FOIA request and then disseminates it out to the other specific departments. So I'm the city fire marshal for Bloomington. I get a lot of requests for both environmental and other things that don't necessarily fall within the FOIA request or FOIA retention of information for the fire marshal's office. Is it my responsibility to forward that to other departments or to DENREC, or is it something that in my letter I just tell them that I don't have that information and let them pursue other methods on their own?
So I don't have the section of the statute up in front of me, but there is a requirement in the state FOIA statute that if you believe that another state agency might have the relevant documents, you point the person to that agency if you know it. So I don't know if anyone else has that part of the statute more readily at hand, but there is a piece of the statute that touches on that. Your obligation is to put them on notice, but you obviously have whatever records you have, not anything beyond that. Does anyone else have that?
Yeah, do you want me to just read it?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, so it's 1003J, requests for other non-custodial records. If all or any portion of a FOIA request seeks records controlled by the public body but are not within its possession, otherwise be fulfilled by the public body with reasonable effort for the records it possesses, then the public body shall promptly request that the relevant custodian provide the non-custodial records to the public body. That might not.
Statute number again? I can't
It's
get it.
in 10003. Yeah. G2. Sorry.
I'd also just note for the state agencies in the room, the FOIA policies have a specific section that addresses that. So there is a fairly standard FOIA policy.
Yeah.
I just wanted to note that for the state agencies in the audience, there is a FOIA policy that most state agencies have adopted. There is a section that addresses that topic specifically and does require referral to another agency.
At DENREC, we have received forwarded emails, forwarded requests from your agency, mostly because for some reason they think that environmental information is handled by DPH. Public health. So we do receive them forwarded. And sometimes we receive them directly as well, so you kind of have to make sure that you're not getting the duplicate requests. Another side of that is with DelDOT, DENREC and DelDOT are connected as well. So sometimes we might receive a request that also includes DelDOT, and so we reach out to DelDOT to say, did you receive this request? How are you responding? Have you, did you notice that it is part of litigation? So there's that connection as well, just to make sure that it's seamless across the agencies.
And just to clarify, what Dory said may be right. What I was thinking of maybe in the state policy, not in the actual statute. Yes.
I have 3 pages of questions, but I'll just consolidate them.
Do you have is it a follow-up or?
Different subject.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about responses, particularly on requests that are.
Play facilitator.
Wanted to ask about responses and the obligation of the body, particularly on questions or requests rather that are from what we term affectionately as frequent flyers, or others who have been advised in the past that you are not the custodian of the records that they are seeking. In one case, and you mentioned it, Lee, environmental questions. So at the county level, just as DPH has, we are routinely hit with all kinds of phase 1 environmental assessments.
Yes.
And that's not the way it's done in Delaware. Obviously, in other states, counties may have that role. But anyway, long story short, I wanted to ask the panelists what their experiences have been in terms of responding to those types of requests. How do you handle somebody who continually comes at you to ask for information that they know full well you do not have, but they're only doing it not because they have a right under the law to ask for it, but because they have to mark a checkbox on their internal protocols. And secondary to that, with respect to responses, any experiences that you have on requests where there is some sort of ambiguity and you need to seek clarification, or you've sent back a response and then the requester doesn't respond. There's no provision under the statute that says how long that request stays open. Is there a working practice that you observe, 5 days, 5 business days, a week? At what point do you say, look, this person never got back to us, we're just going to go ahead and close this out? I know that's a lot to chew also.
Being the newbie here, I'll take that on, but we do the PSAs, and some of the divisions can process it with an address, some need a TPN, a tax parcel number, and some are really good about giving everything that you could ever need to locate the facility, and some give nothing, or one or the other. So we will forward the request out to the group, to the divisions. Note that we are requesting clarification information, and in our clarification email to the requester, we say you have, if we do not hear from you by, and it's typically 10 days is what we put it, then we will close it. If it's if that date is prior to the 15-day, I'll keep it open. And sometimes I will even follow up with them to say, we fulfilled this part of the request, but because you did not provide us with this information, we are not able to process that, and then invite them to send another request if if they are able to locate the information, or if it's that important to them.
Yeah, we do the same thing, Jim. We document that they've not, we send a response out so that we've got in our file that we've made our best efforts to communicate with the individual.
I just wanted
in
to
case
make
they
sure
come
that
back.
there's some, that I'm not alone in taking the practice. Mine's 5 business days from the date of the response. But if someone comes back 6 days, 7 days later, I'll just reactivate the ticket. It's not a big deal. I just wanted to make sure that, like I said, I'm not alone in observing some sort of internal practice, that just says, look, this can't stay open for free forever. You have to, we've made the effort of responding back to you. The ball's in your court, but if you don't come back to us, I mean, we can't process it.
Correct, and like I was saying, where I have my little log, I will indicate in there, sent clarification email.
Right.
No response as of this date, no response as of this date. We'll close out if I don't, so that I remember where we are in the process with that particular request.
Yeah, towards the back.
In the case where the requester, you've told the requester it's going to cost you X amount of dollars to get this information, and you never hear from them again, do you still have to go back to them and communicate with them and say, we're closing this out, or what do you do with that?
So the question was, in a case where you've made a fee estimate and the requester has never gotten back to you again, what do you typically do as a next step?
Lauren, the answer to your question is yes. We do follow up with them. Kristen, is it 10 days as well, or after we've sent we've sent out a communication saying it's going to cost X amount for this information? If we've not heard from them within by 10 days of that communication, we will then send a follow-up communication saying we are since you have not responded to this, we will consider this FOIA request closed. Is that?
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks, Kristen.
Same for us, we don't have a specific set date, but you do need to close out all of your FOIA requests. You can't just leave them open and pending forever.
Back.
So she kind of just answered my question. So in the investigative criminal world, if I have a fire or some type of investigation open, and I send the evidence collected or other items out for to be analyzed, in most cases for me, like the ATF, they're on their own time window. So I give the respective requester, it's going to be a month, check back with me 3 months from now. When they call back 3 months, they're now, is that another FOIA request, or is that just a continuation of the first one? And do I have to continue to log each time they call? And then is there a point in time that that FOIA request stays open until it's finally they get an answer?
So that question is probably getting into a lot of fact specifics that I'm not sure we can give sort of clear guidance on from a legal point of view. So I think the basic premise is, if there has been a request and you're working on responding to it, or the documents are out there or wherever, that probably continues as a request. Beyond that, I'm not sure I can give any clear guidance, but if anyone has sort of practical experience they want to offer.
That's how we've handled it. Our agency has the Office of Animal Welfare, and so there are a lot of investigations that the incidents like dog bites and things like that are considered investigations. And if we've had a request for the results of an investigation, we'll continue to keep that open until that investigation is closed and we're able to share the final results. And in one case, we did have a case where a gentleman had to keep checking back like every 3 months until that was resolved, and we just kept the original open until it was finally closed.
Yep.
Do you respond to him every time, or you just letting him know?
Yeah, just letting him know we've had, there's no new information. Please check back in 3 months, roughly, and give him a timeline. Identify the month, which you say is 3 months from then, and make sure you log that.
And you would need to log each of those contacts in the log, just to document it.
I think there was a question on the aisle.
This may just be a general question to everybody here, but as a FOIA coordinator, is there any group or working groups that get together to speak about FOIA experiences that we may be needing? Working groups like municipal clerks and that type of thing, but for FOIA coordinators, is there anything out there like that that's not?
I'm not aware of one, but if there is, someone else can correct.
Since I am new, I have reached out to DelDOT and specifically to Kristen, and when we were formulating our new policy, we reached out to them for that, and then also if I have questions such as the 10-day rule, or how long should you keep it open, or what's the date that you should say, I have gone out to Kristen and asked her, because they've had the process up and running, and their agency is similar in size to ours, so but that's kind of who I've gone to. Not anything formal, but just
I mean, it just
for
seems
questions.
like a networking group would be great. You know what I mean? Like, we have these questions, and sometimes other people may be having these experiences, and it's nice to be able to have that without, I mean, this is not to be argumentative or anything like that, but without having okay, we can't tell you that because of legal, I would just like to get to another FOIA coordinator and be able to say, hey, did this ever happen to you, and how did this happen?
So one point on that is within the executive branch, there's a page on Delaware.gov where there's a listing of every executive branch agency FOIA coordinator with their phone number, email address. That's a great place to start if you're looking to just bounce an idea off of somebody. Just pick up the phone, give them a call, because and really this is our support group. We meet once a year, but chances are what you're dealing with is something that someone else in government, local government, state government, whatever, has dealt with before. You are absolutely not alone. So I mean, I can say I think, reach out to people, and they can connect you with folks who've dealt with that before.
Can the AG make the list of FOIA coordinators statewide available? Because, to Dan's point, that only applies to the executive branch. So if you're at local level, there is no comprehensive listing or directory available that I know of online that shows every FOIA coordinator in the state. Since we are all required to report to you who the FOIA coordinator is for our bodies, wouldn't it make sense to, as she's suggesting, have some way to communicate with each other and make a directory available?
I think we can definitely take that back and under advisement and figure out whether we can do that.
I mean, we have pay grades here and
I
here. So things that we think are good ideas, like a coffee club, for FOIA coordinators, which is excellent because shared information and shared experiences are great, might not be something we are allowed to do. It might be something that our office thinks is good policy or not. So that's definitely something we'll note down, though. I thank you for suggesting it.
I'll also say our, the requirement that the FOIA coordinators be reported to DOJ isn't often followed. That's why we include it when we send out the invitation each year, just as a kind of a reminder.
I saw another hand, so I'll let
Yep,
her ask a
in the
question.
middle.
I believe the municipalities are required to have their FOIA coordinators on websites, on each of their websites, so, or municipalities are easily
Right, it would just save us, rather than having to visit all 50-some municipalities in the state, and the 3 counties, and every state agency to try to assemble that ourselves. It would be helpful, since if the AG has the information, if they could put it together in some sort of compendium.
As municipal clerks, we do have.
Oh, the clerks have it, okay.
On FOIA by an attorney in Delaware, who's a solicitor, so we do get together on a regular basis for that as well.
Yep.
Is there an introductory level piece about Foia for non-Foia coordinators who wish to disseminate, discuss it with the administrative board ranks of their organizations?
Is it, yeah, I couldn't quite hear the end of the question.
So you're not the Foia coordinator. Is there an introductory level presentation, like a PowerPoint or anything that you guys, that has been created for us to use to inform, educate, and communicate with folks so that we are in prevention mode and we are proactive?
It's not a presentation. You couldn't see who was asking it, I'm sorry. It's not a presentation, but when I'm researching FOIA, I go to the manual, and we have, those topics are all listed there, and it's actually pretty digestible, so that might be a starting point. Can you not hear me at all? Okay. Again, I'll plug that manual again. I mentioned it first. I was the first one in the presentation to talk about it. But that's my starting point for research when I'm addressing those topics. So it's not a presentation point, but you could easily yoink things from there.
And where, I apologize, but where is this manual?
The Department of Justice webpage.
And if I just search Foia Manual, I'll come up with it?
So I think it's under the FOIA link on the
Correct.
Department of Justice website.
Which is under initiatives. Or, I'm sorry, resources.
Google Delaware Foia Manual.
Yeah.
Also, the University of Delaware has their Institute of Public Administration that they offer their local government leadership classes. And every year they offer a FOIA class. It's a half-day class, usually in the spring, and I think it's like $50 to attend. So that's something that I've found useful in the past.
That's a really good idea.
I mean, just to give information, I know that I'm the FOIA coordinator for the city of Seaford. And I know that we actually set up our own class for all of the heads of our departments because a lot of them didn't know the FOIA. So, I mean, I do, as the FOIA coordinator, I do a class, like an in-house class to a lot of the department heads. And if we've had any changes in like our council members and things like that. So, I mean, it's just a suggestion.
Towards the back. So I think the question was, has the AG's office given an opinion on whether employee
advisory opinions?
Oh.
Do I have to, I just want to deny it, can I have an advisory opinion?
No, I think that is something you would need to go to your legal counsel, whoever that may be, for your.
Okay, on that, in section 1005E, it appears as if the AG can give an advisory opinion. So if I have a FOIA request that I think I do not have the answer, but I'm not sure, can I not give it to the AG office to say, can you give me an advisory opinion under 1005E?
So that's not something I've looked at. I don't know if anyone else from the AG's office here has looked at. So that might. So Sounds like to our knowledge that is not something that has happened in the past. I don't know that statutory section, but that's certainly a conversation that we take on offline.
Did you want to say, I can, go ahead.
Yeah, no, no.
I just wanted to add, subsection E talks about, like a petition is for the Attorney General to determine whether a violation has occurred or is about to occur. That's usually when the requester comes in. I just was speaking to subsection E, that the violation of chapter has occurred is about to occur. We're not aware of that, the about to occur portion of that section, referring to anyone other than the requester or the complainant who submitted that request.
So you haven't, I'm sorry.
No, that section specifically is for the AD responding to a petition from someone who was denied or is being denied. It's not to give an advisory opinion. I will say that I've worked with Foia.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? Yes.
Just leave it over here.
Actually, it's the MC from now on.
Sure. If you'll indulge me, I actually wanted to ask a question, or a couple of questions of the group, just so I can understand the lay of the land. Because it came up in the discussion, I'm curious, by show of hands in here, how many of the agencies, be it state, local, have provided in their policies a waiver for fees or exemptions? Can you raise your hand if you have a provision that allows you to exempt fees? 1, 2. Okay, that's interesting. And then my second question was intake process. I know we have to do it by any number of ways, web, email, fax. Is there any agency here that's using third-party software or a third-party vendor to intake your FOIA requests, or are you just doing it with a web page? Raise your hand if you're using a third-party service. Okay.
There's one in the back.
Okay. Other questions?
Well, now I have one more. But this one's directed to the Attorney General, so. This is a request, actually, not so much a question.
I believe it was last summer, July of 2017, that the Attorney General's office promulgated or set forth some new rules for handling complaints, FOIA complaints, and a new timeline that bodies must respond within 3 business days of a complaint being received by your office. We have 3 days, then it goes back to you, and then you can go to the complainant, etc. Is there any consideration to extending that 3-day window? Because it is very, very tight, particularly when you have legal counsel. In my case, I have outside legal, they're contract attorneys. Somebody's on vacation, somebody's tied up in a meeting to stay in, they're at a conference. That 3-day turnaround is nearly impossible to meet, particularly if you've got a complex complaint in front of you. It's not just a simple, they didn't meet. Even if it is simple, you still have research that's involved, et cetera. Can we get some breathing room from the Attorney General on that policy? Perhaps make it 5 business days, so that it's a little more reasonable for bodies to be able to research and appropriately respond. And that's my last question, I promise.
Thank you. All of your questions have been wonderful. I am the chair of the FOIA committee at the Department of Justice now, and our next big task is going to be re-reviewing the outward-facing rules for FOIA and how we process it internally. So if you have any suggestions, we can always process them and consider them in that going forward.
Well, 5 days.
5 days, all right. Got it, 5 days, but any other suggestions?
Is there a contact where we should send those suggestions?
Yes, you may send them.
Just this.
Yeah,
It's fine.
go ahead,
Use
Kim.
the open government at state.de.us
So that's opengovernment@state.de.us for any suggestions. Thank you very much. And if those are all the questions today, I want to say thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you very, very much to our panelists who have been amazing this year. Say nice things in your survey about our panelists. Thank you and goodbye. We'll see you next year.
Thanks, everyone.